Well, we had some lively discussion last week on the show regarding the concept of white privilege. We'll get back to that coming up and some aspects of that conversation last week. But we're going to spend a bit of time here on the show today for your Thanksgiving Monday talking about this concept. And Desmond Cole is here. Desmond, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
From your perspective, how would you define white privilege?
I would define white privilege as a description of the world that we live in that suggests that having white skin in this part of the world has several advantages, but also it means that having white skin is not attributed to people's identity the way that having another skin color is. And so it's kind of an invisible thing that a lot of people don't realize that they have because it doesn't come up in conversation. It's not mentioned when they make a mistake. It's kind of invisible, but that's not the same for people who are not white.
And so give me an example.
So for example, there's an incident in the news where somebody has committed a crime. There are a lot of situations in which people who look like me, we hear that and we go, oh gosh, I hope that it's not a black person. The reason that we do that is not because we're nuts, but it's because we know that there is a really negative stereotype out there about black people and crime. And what we want is to try and combat that by saying we shouldn't be judged as a race of people by the actions of a few.
Well, I agree with that. I can't assume that you're a criminal or a murderer, that I'm in some sort of danger at the moment, even if we disagree, because you're black and I'm white. On the other hand, if you take just Toronto for an example, where we are, the percentage of murder victims and murderers it vastly outstrips the black population. There is an issue there. It's a gang thing. You have to be able to separate them, but just because that's happening doesn't mean somehow white people are privileged.
Well, let's talk about that. So first of all, we can also say something about the black community in that they live in poverty far more often than people who look like you do. They have worse socioeconomic outputs for their education, for their income, for their health, for all kinds of things.
But black or white, poverty's no excuse for shooting your neighbor.
No, but let's stick to the topic here. Let's talk about something actually that's a positive rather than a negative. And I'll show you how the dynamic works exactly the same. So let's look at Toronto City Council. Half of the people who live in the city are not white. They are of another background. And yet if you look at our leaders in Toronto City Council, if you look at all the big banks, if you look at all of the nonprofit organizations, it doesn't look 50% non-white. There's a reason for that, Jerry. And it's the same reason that more black people are in poverty, have issues graduating from school, and it's that there's a bias in our society. When we talk about white privilege, we're simply trying to define that bias so that we can challenge it and end it.
Okay, so you ran for city council, since you've brought that up. The banks are a different deal. The ordinary citizen has no impact on what a bank does. All right, but when it comes to elections, you ran for city council, so you presented to the citizens in the ward in which you ran an opportunity to elect a black person. I would assume maybe you weren't the only non-white person running. You also weren't the only non-white person living there. Mm-hmm. So did you fail to get elected simply because Desmond Cole is black, or did you fail to get elected because somehow you didn't reach all the people, minorities, non-minorities, everybody sufficiently?
And that's the thing about that is I'm not trying to tell you that I didn't succeed because I'm not white.
Okay.
What I'm trying to tell you, though, is that if somebody didn't like the fact that I was running, it would be much more likely that my skin color would be an issue than if they didn't like a white candidate who was running. And I'll give you examples. Just yesterday, it was reported that a woman in North Etobicoke, Munira Abukar, her signs were vandalized by people who said, go home. During a debate recently, and I know we're going to talk about this a little later, somebody stood up when Olivia Chow was at a debate and said, go back to China. And he did media interviews afterwards where he defended his position, saying she's not really a Canadian. This is what I mean. These things don't happen to white people in our society.
No, people will not vote for John Tory because they think he came from privilege, which he did. And Olivia Chow will go out and put up bus signs saying, you ever see John Tory on a bus? I mean, that's a class situation, isn't it? We fight these political fights unfairly sometimes, but I think it's a lot easier if you're not white to say, I'm going to blame whatever my lack of achievement here on everybody else. I won't take my own responsibility.
And you see, I find that sad and amusing at the same time, Jerry, because it's a suggestion that...
Well, who do I have to blame if I don't succeed?
Well, that's a suggestion, what you just said, that someone like me goes out into the world looking for excuses for why they fail. I don't want any excuses for why black and brown and Chinese people of all races, I don't want any excuses for the reasons why they're in the situations they're in. I want to fix it, but I can't do that unless I'm honest in describing what's going on. It's not about an excuse. Racism actually exists, but the thing about white privilege is that every time somebody who's experienced brings it up, they get attacked.
Okay.
They get challenged as if what they're saying is sneaky and conniving rather than their own real experience.
Well, let me ask it to you this way. Do you think all white people are racist?
No, and that's not what white privilege means.
No, I understand that. But I'm trying to make a point. I'm going to make a numerical point here. So you've got a big portion of white people who would happily vote for somebody, we'll stay with the city council example, on what they think is the merit, not because the person is of any particular race. And 47% of the population of the city of Toronto is not white. So you answer your own question. Why aren't minorities getting elected?
I think that there are a lot of reasons. So you had Tariq Fatah on here. He talked about the fact that a lot of people of color don't have the same networks in this part of the world as white people do. That's just a simple fact, right?
Well, it depends how long you've lived here.
It absolutely does, but that's a factor. It's
okay,
one, it's
but
one
if you
factor
just
of
came
many.
here from Czechoslovakia last year,
Yeah.
you're in the same situation.
Sure, but again, what I'm trying to say to you is there are a lot of reasons why people who are looking like myself feel differently when they participate in society. And it's not because it's all in their heads. It's because of the experiences that they actually have when they go out into the world.
But then why don't other minorities vote for somebody who looks like you?
Well,
because you know what, it's not going to be very long, in fact, until white people in the city of Toronto are a minority. It's 30% for the province of minority representation in the province of Ontario is 30%, but in Toronto it's 47%.
This is where these things come together. So we know that poor people don't vote as much as people who have money, right? So that
yeah, but if they don't get representation, then in that case they've only got themselves to blame.
Sure, but it's not their fault that, for example, people who come to this country from other parts of the world change their names because they feel like if they put they don't feel like, there's been many studies done on this. If you put a resume into an employer and you have a name that sounds like you're from Southeast Asia or from Africa, people will actually pass you over. Now,
that's true, but you know what else
hang on, let me finish. That's not our fault. That's a systemic problem in society that we didn't choose. So when we talk about white privilege, that's what we're talking about. And I'm shocked that we get attacked when we raise these points and say that they're a problem.
Well, there's more than just a race aspect to that. There's a cultural aspect, because I would invite you to send in a resume with the name Bo Cephas on it and see whether or not they, you know, if you've got what sounds like a Smoky Mountains, Tennessee hillbilly name, you'll get passed over as well.
But all of these
factors... I'm not saying that's right, I'm saying...
Right, okay. I'm not saying it's right either, so there we agree. But all of these factors are especially present in people who are what I call racialized. And the reason I use the term racialized is because I don't think race exists, Jerry, but being pointed out for your race, being described by your race, that is what is happening to people who look like me in our society, and it's wrong and it has to stop.
Okay, I agree with you that in essence race doesn't exist, and if you're a Christian person and you believe that everybody came from Adam and Eve, we're all the same people, right? However, that's a philosophical discussion that doesn't meet the reality on the street.
No, but the reality on the street, as I've said, is that if you look at any measure of success, people of color are doing